I think we ought to read only the kind of books that wound or stab us. If the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. That is my belief. Franz Kafka, called the expert of power by Elias Canetti, one of the most influential and loved writers of the 20th century, continually explores systems of arbitrary power in his work and the individuals that are caught up in them. The straightforwardness of his writing is deceptive. The words he uses aren't difficult, that's true. I, for one, had to read the Metamorphosis in high school. However, his polysemitic way of writing, meaning the multiple meanings he conveys, is often especially hard to grasp and lends itself perfectly to in-depth analysis from many angles. He is the man that lent his name to the term Kafkaesque, which we'll talk about in depth in this video, and he is the one that said, "I am made of literature. I'm nothing else and cannot be anything else." So today, I'm gonna honor the 100th year of his death with a deep analysis of the last short story he has ever written, 2 years before his death, which is called A Hunger Artist. A story about a man who, one could say, died for his art, and a story full of paradoxes that I just cannot seem to shake. We'll take the story as a point of departure to talk about Kafka's life, his writing philosophy, what he has written in his journals about loneliness, and his critique of society. Night, he famously said, is not night enough to write. I will, as always, read you extracts from the English translation, as well as the German original, to give you a feeling of the sound of the story in the language that Kafka has written in, German. Buckle up, because this is probably going to be the longest video I've ever made. If you end up liking this video, giving it a like and leaving a comment really helps this channel out. And if you're feeling extra generous, I'll leave my Ko-fi account as the first link in the description box. Let's get into it now. The story opens the following way, quote, "In the last decades, interest in hunger artists has declined considerably. Whereas in earlier days there was good money to be earned putting on major productions of this sort under one's own management, nowadays that is totally impossible. Those were different times. Back then the hunger artist captured the attention of the entire city. From day to day, while the fasting lasted, participation increased. Everyone wanted to see the hunger artist, at least daily. So in essence, the story opens by telling us that hunger artistry used to be a very popular art, that when there was a hunger artist in town, people used to visit him daily, but as trends moved forward, he got left behind, which immediately raises the first question: what is a hunger artist, and did they actually exist? The answer is yes. According to the Wikipedia definition, hunger artists, or starvation artists, were performers common in Europe and America in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th century, who starved themselves for extended periods of time for the amusement of paying audiences. Let's take a look at some of the hunger artists I researched. I'm gonna put a couple of examples on the screen of hunger artists who fasted in their cells. Here's, for example, Auguste Victoria Schenk in 1905 and hunger artist Papus at the turn of the 20th century. Kafka did base his story on one particular hunger artist whose name was Giovanni Succi. Giovanni Succi did his first extended fast in 1888 in Florence. He got an invitation from the Medical Academy so that the faculty could study the consequences of fasting on the human organism. At the end of the 19th century, he came to Vienna and wanted to fast for 40 days. The police, though, didn't allow him that and reduced it to only 30 days. based on some newspaper articles that I found, one can really tell what a sensation that must have been at that time. This newspaper from Vienna published updates several times a week about the artist's condition, including details such as his weight, and they even took photos to demonstrate his own body's reactions. He has lost 9 kilos after 10 days of fasting. The newspaper also reported that Giovanni himself said, 30 days is not enough, because for me, and that is very important because it also comes back in Kafka's story, fasting is the easiest thing. I'll just take a couple of minutes right now to shed some light on the wider context of the time that Kafka was writing in. Kafka's works are considered works of literary modernism. This kind of writing often focuses on outsider protagonists, putting them in social contexts and demonstrating how they simply don't fit in. What probably influenced Kafka as well were the philosophical, psychological, and economic ideas of that time. Karl Marx talked about how everything one does is shaped by the economic needs of the society you live in. Freud suggests around the same time that there is so much that we're not conscious of, that there are forces inside that drive us, and he came up with his theory on the id, the ego, and the superego. All that sounds very deterministic and even a little pessimistic, if you want. It's a little bit like saying you're not really making decisions because you don't control your actions or your personality. On top of that, World War I has just ended and it has shown humanity the dark side of industrialization. It demonstrated how, for the first time, it was not man against man anymore on the battlefield. There were gases and weapons that were much more efficient and also, of course, much more dehumanizing. So as we now come back to Kafka's story, we see that the hunger artist in his story is a very committed man. He just sits there doing his art of starvation, locked in a cage with a bit of straw to sleep on and a bit of water to moisten his lips. To the hunger artist's only frustration, it seems that there are people who don't think he's genuine. He especially feels that from the people who are assigned to make sure that the hunger artist doesn't eat during the night, because they're often deliberately unwatchful, thinking that he has found a way to smuggle in food anyways. I quote, "Apart from the changing groups of spectators, there were also constant observers chosen by the public. Strangely enough, they were usually butchers, who, always 3 at a time, were given the task of observing the hunger artist day and night, so that he didn't get something to eat in some secret manner. It was, however, merely a formality, introduced to reassure the masses, for those who understood knew well enough that during the period of fasting, the hunger artist would never, under any circumstances, have eaten the slightest thing, not even if compelled by force. The honor of his art forbade it." Naturally, none of the watchers understood that. Sometimes there were nightly groups of watchers who carried out their vigil very laxly, deliberately sitting together in a distant corner and putting all their attention into playing cards there, clearly intending to allow the hunger artist a small refreshment, which, according to their way of thinking, he could get from some secret supplies. Nothing was more excruciating to the hunger artist than such watchers. They depressed him. They made his fasting terribly difficult. I'm going to read you the same few sentences in German now. Außer den wechselnden Zuschauern waren auch ständige, vom Publikum gewählte Wächter da, merkwürdigerweise gewöhnlich Fleischhauer, welche immer 3 gleichzeitig die Aufgabe hätten, Tag und Nacht den Hungerkünstler zu beobachten, damit er nicht etwa auf irgendeine heimliche Weise doch Nahrung zu sich nehme. Es war das aber lediglich eine Formalität, eingeführt zur Beruhigung der Massen. Denn die Eingeweihten wussten wohl, dass der Hungerkünstler während der Hungerzeit niemals, unter keinen Umständen, selbst unter Zwang nicht, auch das Geringste nur gegessen hätte. Die Ehre seiner Kunst verbot dies. Freilich, nicht jeder Wächter konnte das begreifen. Es fanden sich manchmal nächtliche Wachgruppen, welche die Bewachung sehr lax durchführten, absichtlich in eine ferne Ecke sich zusammensetzten und dort sich in Kartenspiel vertieften, in der offensichtlichen Absicht, dem Hungerkünstler eine kleine Erfrischung zu gönnen, die er ihrer Meinung nach aus irgendwelchen geheimen Vorräten hervorholen konnte. Nichts war dem Hungerkünstler quälender als solche Wächter. Sie machten ihn trübselig, machten ihm das Hungern entsetzlich schwer. The impresario, which is his manager, always stops his fast after 40 days. Our hunger artist, however, says that he could go on much longer and he would want to. So why only 40 days? We'll come back to the symbolism of the number 40 later, but for now, the following reason is given to us. The impresario had set the maximum length of time for the fast at 40 days. He could never allow the fasting go on beyond that point, not even in the cosmopolitan cities. And in fact, he had a good reason. Experience had shown that for about 40 days, one could increasingly whip up a city's interest by gradually increasing advertising, but that then the people turned away. One could demonstrate a significant decline in popularity. In this respect, there were, of course, small differences amongst different towns and among different countries, but as a rule, it was true that 40 days was the maximum length of time. I think here it becomes pretty obvious why Kafka's stories are often read as a critique of capitalism and the modern work life. Not only does our artist have to adapt his art to the economic interests of the people, he also doesn't care about the clock. He refuses to be on the clock because he never sees his art as something that is difficult or something he would want to clock out of eventually. A complete spectacle is made out of the first time the hunger artist is fed again, making him look incredibly miserable in front of the crowd. He's only miserable though because he had to stop fasting. I quote again, "Now he was supposed to stand up straight and tall and go to eat, something which, when he just imagined it, made him feel nauseous right away. With great difficulty, he repressed mentioning this only out of consideration for the women. And he looked up into the eyes of these women, apparently so friendly, but in reality so cruel, and shook his excessively heavy head on his feeble neck." But then happened what always happened. The impresario came, and in silence, the music made talking impossible, raised his arms over the hunger artist, as if inviting heaven to look upon its work, here on the straw, this unfortunate martyr, something the hunger artist certainly was, only in a completely different sense, then grabbed the hunger artist around his thin waist, in the process wanting with his exaggerated caution to make people believe that here he had to deal with something fragile, handed him over, not without secretly shaking him a little, so that the hunger artist's legs and upper body swung back and forth uncontrollably, to the women who had in the meantime turned as pale as death. At this point, the hunger artist endured everything. His head lay on his chest. It was as if it had inextricably rolled around and just stopped there. His body was arched back. His legs, in an impulse of self-preservation, pressed themselves together at the knees, but scraped the ground, as if they were not really on the floor, but were looking for the real ground. And the entire weight of his body, admittedly very small, lay against one of the women, who appealed for help with flustered breath, for she had not imagined her post of honor would be like this, and then stretched her neck as far as possible to keep her face from the least contact with the hunger artist. But then, when she couldn't manage this, and her more fortunate companion didn't come to her assistance, but trembled and remained content to hold in front of her hunger artist's hand. To hold in front of her the hunger artist's hand, that small bundle of knuckles, she broke into tears, to the delighted laughter of the auditorium, and had to be relieved by an attendant who had been standing ready for some time. As being a hunger artist becomes less and less popular, he ends up joining a circus, and his cage is placed next to the animals. Because of his placement, he is often ignored by the masses of people. He is also no longer under supervision of a manager there, so he's finally able to break his fasting record. He fasts days and days on end. Actually, no one even knows how long he's fasted, because the people have stopped to change the sign in front of his cage that count the days. So he wastes away without anyone noticing. Someone eventually walks by and notices the empty cage. Probably thinking they could use the cage for something else, the random person working at the circus discovers that the artist is dying away under the straw. As his last words, he's confessing to the man that he has only fasted because during his lifetime he never found any food that he liked. I'm gonna read you his last words now. "I always wanted you to admire my fasting," said the hunger artist. "But we do admire it," said the supervisor obligingly. "But you shouldn't admire it," said the hunger artist. "Well, then, we don't admire it," said the supervisor. "But why shouldn't we admire it?" "Because I had to fast. I can't do anything else," said the hunger artist. "Just look at you," said the supervisor. "Why can't you do anything else?" "Because," said the hunger artist, lifting his head a little and, with his lips pursed as if for a kiss, speaking right into the supervisor's ear so that he wouldn't miss anything. "Because I couldn't find a food which I enjoyed. If I'd found that, believe me, I would not have made a spectacle of myself, and would have eaten to my heart's content, like you and everyone else." I'll again read you the same passage in German. "Immerfort wollte ich, dass ihr mein Hungern bewundert", sagte der Hungerkünstler. "Wir bewundern es auch", sagte der Aufseher entgegenkommend. "Ihr solltet es aber nicht bewundern", sagte der Hungerkünstler. "Nun, dann bewundern wir es also nicht", sagte der Aufseher. "Warum sollen wir es denn nicht bewundern?" "Weil ich hungern muss. Ich kann nicht anders", sagte der Hungerkünstler. "Da sieh mal einer", sagte der Aufseher. "Warum kannst du denn nicht anders?" "Weil ich", sagte der Hungerkünstler, hob das Köpfchen ein wenig und sprach mit wie zum Mund gespitzten Lippen gerade in das Ohr des Aufsehers hinein, damit nichts verloren ginge. "Weil ich nicht die Speise finden konnte, die mir schmeckt. Hätte ich sie gefunden, glaube mir, ich hätte kein Aufsehen gemacht und mich voll gegessen, wie du und alle." After his death, his cage is repurposed and a young panther takes the artist's place. This panther is incredibly popular and seems to be the complete opposite of our hunger artist in almost every way. He's full of vitality and loves eating. So our hunger artist dies completely alienated from other people, alone. Many have actually interpreted that the way he forms his mouth to a kiss when uttering his last words indicated that all he was looking for was connection, and that maybe he just wanted to be understood. The only one giving him a little bit of that connection in this story are the children that are talked about in the beginning. It says that, quote, "While for grown-ups, the hunger artist was often merely a joke, something they participated in because it was fashionable, the children looked on amazed, their mouths open, holding each other's hands for safety, as he sat there on scattered straw, spurning a chair, in a black tights, looking pale, with his ribs sticking out prominently, sometimes nodding politely, answering questions with a forced smile, even sticking his arm through the bars to let people feel how emaciated he was, but then completely sinking back into himself, so that he paid no attention to anything, not even to what was so important to him, the striking of the clock, which was the single furnishing in the cage, merely looking out in front of him, with his eyes almost shut, and now and then sipping from a tiny glass of water to moisten his lips." I think this is such a beautiful detail on how children, because they don't have a formed worldview yet, are not afraid of the differences they notice between the hunger artist and them. You know, they see that he has a tiny wrist and they want to touch it. They want him to tell them about the stories of his vagabond life. To them, the differences are interesting and not repulsive. On the theme of suffering, Kafka wrote in a letter when he was 20, "When you stand before me and look at me, what do you know about the pain that is in me, and what do I know about yours? And if I were to throw myself before you and cry and tell you, what more would you know about me than about hell if someone told you that it is hot and terrible? For this reason alone, we humans should stand before one another as reverently, as thoughtfully, as lovingly as we do before the entrance to hell." So I think Kafka very early on in his life thought about the fact that it's so difficult to communicate one's own suffering and that we just do not know what's going on in other people. It really reminds me of some advice or quote I read somewhere, I think 10 years ago at this point, but it said basically that if you don't know a person that you're going to interact with, always assume that they're going through the most difficult time in their life at the moment, right? And treat them accordingly, because you just never know. Many parallels can actually be drawn between Kafka's life and the stories that he wrote. The artist lives in a small cage, just like Kafka lived in a small apartment. Kafka definitely also had many other experiences of deep suffering. It's quite well known that he had a difficult relationship with his authoritarian father. He also died at the age of only 40 because of tuberculosis. He worked a job at an insurance company that he hated, and he told his friend Max Brod to destroy everything he had written after he dies. "Nur die Gewalt des Lebens fühle ich," has Franz Kafka written into his diary in 1913. And translating that freely, I would say that means, "I only feel the violence of life." What we can say about Kafka, though, is that he's always exploring themes of power. As I already mentioned, Elias Canetti famously called Kafka the expert of power. All of his stories are in some way about class relations, and Kafka always identifies himself with the small people, the smallest entities, those that are repressed by the system. This is reflected by the creatures in his novels, like little bugs or mice. And the question of power in The Hunger Artist is a very interesting one, because he deprives himself of power in a double sense. On the one hand, if you become small and you starve yourself, you cannot exercise power over others. But also, if you starve yourself and become small, the powerful are not interested in exercising power over you. Again, Kafka himself didn't want to be big or famous. His friend Max Brod actually frequently told him, you should publish a novel and you'll be rich. He didn't want to. He didn't want to become mighty and big. He'd rather stay small. And he apparently actually spent his Sundays in parks where poor families were spending their time and their kids were playing. So he was never interested in aspiring to be rich or writing for the rich. And for this tendency of staying small, he was often criticized. Bert Brecht, a very political writer, for example, accused Kafka of not being political enough. His stories, Brecht said, never have a clear call to action. And that is true and frustrating in a way. At least for me, when I'm reading this story, I'm continuously thinking, why? What's the point? What is the meaning of his auto-destruction? And I've prepared a pretty big presentation on the hunger artist for a course that I'm currently taking in university about the poetics of suffering. And even there, we talked about different meanings that suffering can have. Right? Suffering can come as a sign for something, as a warning in a way. It can come as a form of knowing or become a form of knowing. It can be felt to pay some debt or as salvation. But again, I find that none of these concepts really apply to our hunger artist here. But he still doesn't seem to be able to stop his art. Just like Kafka, who famously said, "I am made of literature, I am nothing else and cannot be anything else." Just as our hunger artist is obsessed with starving himself, writing possessed Kafka. He said himself that he cannot not write, and it's a kind of necessity for him that he cannot escape. What we do know about our hunger artist is that he suffers not because he can't eat, but because people don't understand him. The masses think there is a trick. They don't appreciate him. They assume fasting must be difficult for everyone because it is difficult for them. Such a basic human error. In the end, though, when he utters his last words, he shapes his lips to a kiss, which might indicate again that he is looking for intimacy and connection. So maybe what we can say is that his suffering comes as a sign that signals the distance he feels from other people. But of course, just because it's not so easy to put a finger on it, I think Kafka is actually a very political author in the sense that he displays the conditions of our society, reflects on them, and criticizes them. His stories always seem to say something like, look, not everyone can participate in the success that is always talked about. Our hunger artist, for one, can't. And to say that everyone gets what they deserve is very problematic. Purely autobiographical reading of the story, I think, can miss many other points. We can see, for example, how the story is loaded with symbols, which might give us a clue about what Kafka wanted to tell us. So let's look at some of those symbols. First of all, the cage. The cage separates our hunger artist from other people. It's the division between him and the outside world. What's interesting, though, is that he puts himself into it. Many have interpreted the cage as the cage of capitalist entertainment. So that would mean that we all have to go into cages in order to do our work because we have to survive. And that there are some people who are happy to live in the cage, like the panther, for example, in the same way as some people are happy to live under capitalism because it works for them. The cage has also been interpreted as the opposite, though. It is the thing that actually prevents the hunger artist from actually having to participate in the modern world, and that it is his way of refusing to play the game of capitalism. This interpretation goes hand in hand with the fact that he never looks at the clock, the essential symbol for a structured workday of the responsible adult. He refuses to give in to the notion of being on the clock, because his art doesn't have a beginning or an end. The paradoxical nature of the cage in any way is that he is watched all the time. There's people around him at all moments of the day, yet he's so lonely. Again, drawing a parallel to Kafka, here's what Kafka said about loneliness when making art. I quote, "You once said that you would like to sit beside me while I write. Listen, in that case I could not write at all. For writing means revealing oneself to access, that utmost of self-revelation and surrender in which a human being, when involved with others, would feel he was losing himself, and from which, therefore, he will always shrink. As long as he is in the right mind, for everyone wants to live as long as he is alive, even the degree of self-revelation and surrender is not enough for writing. Writing that springs from the surface of existence, when there is no other way and deeper wells have dried up, is nothing and collapses the moment a truer emotion makes the surface shake. That is why one can never be alone enough when one writes, where there can never be enough silence around one when one writes. Why even night is not night enough." Moving on to the symbol of the number 40, he is never allowed to fast for more than 40 days. Remember, that was also the case for the actual hunger artist that inspired Kafka to write this work. If you're familiar with the Bible, you probably know that Moses spent 40 days fasting, and Jesus also fasted for 40 days in the wilderness. Reading the Bible metaphorically, though, 40 days often just means a very long time. Usually, however, fasting is a way to learn to deal with temptations. It's a way of self-purification and making up for something. But again, this doesn't really apply to our hunger artist. For him, fasting is the easiest thing in the world. This could be another way of showing how the artist has to confine himself to arbitrary systems of, this time, religious power. It could be that the 40 days maximum was set because people just simply can't allow anyone to fast longer than Jesus did. The next symbol is the panther he's replaced with, who, in a way, I already said, embodies the complete opposite of everything the hunger artist represents. He's full of vitality, wants to eat, he brings the circus a lot of money and attention, and seemingly people can identify themselves more with the animal than with our hunger artist. And lastly, for the motive of simply not eating, I just wanted to say that Kafka was a strict vegetarian. He might have even gone vegan towards the end of his life because he wanted to cure himself. In Kafka's time, there was unfortunately no cure for tuberculosis. And as we know, he died a couple of years after writing this story. In summary, after everything I've said, I think it stays very difficult to interpret this story. It could be that it is a simple allegory for the committed artist whose life is assigned to their work, an artist whose only possibility is to carry out his life's work. He simply cannot live any other way because art is his refuge from the world. Maybe it is that, but at the end of our story, his art kills him. One could say that the exact drive to make art is the thing that makes him disappear in the end. And yes, he's not taking money for what he does, but also can it be purely for art's sake if he also really wants people to watch? Or maybe this story should just be taken literally. Maybe it is a critique of the industrialization of the production of food. I mean, I don't know about you, but if I would have to trace back everything that I've eaten today to its roots, maybe I would want to stop eating too. Maybe the story is a parable for the suffering of the working class, or our entertainment industry, where the audience just quickly gets bored and moves on to the next best thing. Honestly, I still have a lot of questions. Like, why were the people who were watching him usually butchers? What does that mean? And what kind of food would he have liked to eat? I feel as though what Kafka does very well is writing very directly and provocatively without actually sending a clear moral message. He leaves a lot of room for different interpretations. So actually, while preparing for this video, for example, I didn't really know where to start, and once I got started, it was difficult for me to stop. I can, on the one hand, talk for a long time, and on the other hand, I still feel like it's not very graspable what I'm saying, and I feel as though I'm constantly missing the point. But I think that's actually why Kafka is so loved nowadays. You know, at my university in Vienna, as soon as there is a Kafka seminar, it's overrun, it's impossible to get a spot. I still wanted to talk about the term Kafkaesque. Basically, something that is Kafkaesque is a somewhat bureaucratic nightmare situation. So often the protagonists in Kafka's stories have to go through complicated, bewildering processes of bureaucracy, navigating systems they don't really understand, that don't seem to make a lot of sense. So it can be extremely frustrating, confusing, frightening, unpleasant situations, similar to the ones that Kafka describes in his novels, right? That's what the term Kafkaesque is used for. If you still don't know, or you want to get a better feeling for something that is Kafkaesque, you should try moving to France. It'll teach you real well. So, to sum up, Kafka's stories are comic and tragic at the same time, as David Foster Wallace said. Max Brod, actually his friend, so Kafka's friend, said that when Kafka read from his work, they simply couldn't stop laughing, you know, and it's like this absurdity that I think that really draws us into Kafka nowadays. Kierkegaard actually said that absurdity is ultimately a positive thing, and he said it's the absurdness in religious stories, for example, that point to their essential truth. And it definitely speaks for the story that I can sit here talking longer than it takes to actually read the story, trying to analyze it, and still feeling like I barely even scratched the surface. So, to end with, I will now read you the first few lines in the German original. I always find it really important to hear the actual exact words that a writer has chosen. I find that there's a kind of atmosphere that is transported through the language, even if you cannot understand the exact words. And there's also a kind of directness in the German language that makes this story even more eerie, in my opinion. And of course, I hope to inspire you all to learn German. Oh, and just the last thing before I go. If you want more on Kafka, I know that Hardcore Literature, so Benjamin McAvoy from the Hardcore Literature Book Club, posted a fantastic, in-depth read-through of the Metamorphosis lately on his Spotify, I think. I'll link to the podcast in the description down below, but it's, as always, great and longer than an hour, and I feel like I don't have to make a video about it because it already exists. It's great, so can highly recommend that. Okay, so thanks for listening, and let's get this German business going. Ein Hungerkünstler von Franz Kafka. In den letzten Jahrzehnten ist das Interesse an Hungerkünstlern sehr zurückgegangen. Während es sich früher gut lohnte, große derartige Vorführungen in eigener Regie zu veranstalten, ist dies heute völlig unmöglich. Es waren andere Zeiten. Damals beschäftigte sich die ganze Stadt mit dem Hungerkünstler. Von Hungertag zu Hungertag stieg die Teilnahme. Jeder wollte den Hungerkünstler zumindest einmal täglich sehen. An den späteren Tagen gab es Abonnenten, welche tagelang vor dem kleinen Gitterkäfig saßen. Auch in der Nacht fanden Besichtigungen statt, zur Erhöhung der Wirkung bei Fackelschein. An schönen Tagen wurde der Käfig ins Freie getragen, und nun waren es besonders die Kinder, denen der Hungerkünstler gezeigt wurde. Während er für die Erwachsenen oft nur ein Spaß war, an dem sie der Mode halber teilnahmen, sahen die Kinder staunend, mit offenem Mund, der Sicherheit halber einander bei der Hand haltend, zu, wie er bleich, im schwarzen Trikot, mit mächtig vorstehenden Rippen, sogar einen Sessel verschmähend, auf hingestreutem Stroh saß, einmal höflich nickend, angestrengt lächelnd Fragen beantwortete, auch durch das Gitter den Arm streckte, um seine Magerkeit befühlen zu lassen, dann aber wieder ganz in sich selbst versank um niemanden sich kümmerte, nicht einmal um den für ihn so wichtigen Schlag der Uhr, die das einzige Möbelstück des Käfigs war, sondern nur vor sich hinsah, mit oft geschlossenen Augen, und hie und da aus dem winzigen Gläschen Wasser nippte, um sich die Lippen zu feuchten.